Junior cycle history students, I have seen a lot of confusion about what you need to study for your junior cycle exams. So this is a definitive list of everything that you have to study. This is what we have been told as teachers that you have to cover. So you must study one ancient or medieval civilization, such as ancient Rome or the Normans. You must study early Christian Ireland. You have to study life and death in medieval times. You have to do the Renaissance, conquest and colonization. So that's looking at people like Cortez and Pizarro, and then the impacts of maybe things like the slave trade. You must study one reformer. So my students would have done Martin Luther. You must study one example of a plantation and one pattern of settlement. So my students would have done the growth of towns. You must study one European or world revolution. So for example, the American Revolution or the French Revolution. As a separate topic, you must study one example of an Irish rebellion that happened pre-20th century. So for example, the 1798 rebellion. You cannot argue that Ireland is in Europe, therefore it should count as a European revolution. Unfortunately, it doesn't, okay? Let me tell you this, the course is quite vast. If there was a way to cut corners like that, we, your teachers, would have figured it out. So you must study the famine and the Irish diaspora. You must study one sporting, cultural or social movement like the GAA. You must study two parliamentary leaders. So my students will have studied Redmond and Carson. You might have studied someone else, maybe O'Connell and Parnell, but you must study two. You must look at key events in Irish history that took place at the start of the 20th century. So things like the Home Rule crisis, the 1916 Rising, the War of Independence, Anglo-Irish treaty negotiations, and the Civil War. You must look at one example of a communist country and one example of a fascist country. You need to do the causes, course and consequences of World War I or World War II. So you only need to study one, you don't have to do both wars. You must study the Holocaust. You must study Ireland in either World War I or World War II. You must study the Cold War, but like the Cold War is made up of many different events, so you might have studied different kind of Cold War aspects compared to, say, my students, and that's okay. You have to look at the 1960s world history and you have to look at 1960s Irish history. You might have a little bit of overlap here, so my students would have some overlap between the Cold War and the 1960s world, and they'd have some overlap between the 1960s Ireland and the Troubles. You must study the causes, course and consequences of the Troubles. You must look at an international organisation like the EU or the UN. You must look at Ireland's links with Europe. So my students would have done this kind of throughout the 3 years. So things like early Christian Ireland, there's links between Ireland and Europe there. The Normans, there's links between Ireland and Europe there. 1798, there's links between Ireland and Europe. 1916, there's links between Ireland and Europe. And obviously World War II, there's links between Ireland and Europe. You must cover the changing experience of women in 20th century Ireland. You need to have a little look at important technological developments. So you might have done this at the very end of your 3 years, or you might have done it during the 3 years. So for example, my students, when studying the Renaissance, they would have also looked at the printing press. When they were studying World War II, they would have looked at nuclear technology. And then the final aspect from the kind of orange and green list here is you must study one example of patterns of change, okay? You might do kind of multiple examples maybe in class, but you only need to know one example off, like one pattern of change off. So my students would do crime and punishment, my colleagues might do health and medicine, they might do kind of work and leisure, but you only need one example of patterns of change. Now the yellow kind of boxes at the bottom of the page, these are kind of keywords or terms that relate to the work of the historian and the work of the archaeologist. So you might have studied these maybe at the start of first year, maybe you did them throughout your 3 years, but basically this is just a list of important kind of words and terms that you should be familiar with. So things like primary source, secondary source, significance, chronological awareness, and I've listed all of those kind of points there. And I made a separate video earlier today talking about some of those points as well. And then at the very bottom we have the work of the archaeologist and kind of new technology and archaeology. So I'm hoping that's helpful. Like I said, I've seen a lot of confusion surrounding what you have to do and what you don't have to do. So this is hopefully your kind of definitive list. If you want, you can just kind of screenshot it and get it there, or you can find the Word document on my website.